forms of power we were discussing earlier. How do those pathways to power, force, inheritance, divine mandate? How do they fit into this modern system where the Constitution is supposed to be the ultimate authority?
That's a great question. And it's something that the notes touch on as they delve deeper into the Mexican political system. They point out that while the Constitution aims to create a truly democratic society, the reality is that those older forms of power haven't completely disappeared. They still lurk beneath the surface.
So you're saying that even in a modern democracy, you might see traces of those older power dynamics at play.
Absolutely. For instance, even though Mexico has free and fair elections, there might still be powerful political families or economic elites who exert a lot of influence behind the scenes.
So it's like those powers and instrument dynamics we talked about, wealth connections, social status, those things still matter, even in a system designed to limit their impact.
Right. And you also see echoes of that divine mandate idea when politicians use religious rhetoric or appeal to traditional values to bolster their authority.
It's like this fascinating blend of old and new, where those traditional forms of power haven't gone away. They've just adapted to the modern political landscape.
Exactly. And this all circles back to the idea of power as a flux. Even in a system seemingly defined by a constitution and democratic principles, power is constantly being negotiated, challenged, and redistributed. It's never truly static.
So it's a process, not a finished product.
Precisely. And that's what makes studying power dynamics so interesting. It's a constantly evolving dance between different players, ideologies, and institutions.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together, but I'm still curious about some of the nuts and bolts of the Mexican political system. You mentioned that the Constitution lays out three key systems: presidential, electoral, and federal. We talked about the presidential system a bit, but can we dive deeper into those other two, the electoral and federal systems?
Of course. Let's start with the electoral system. The notes point out that Mexico has a system of proportional representation. So basically, the number of seats a political party wins in Congress is roughly in line with the percentage of votes they get in the election.
So it's not winner take all like in some other countries.
Right. This system aims to make sure that a wider range of political views are represented in Congress, even if one party doesn't win a majority of the votes.
It sounds like a way to promote diversity and inclusivity in the political process. What are some of the pros and cons of a system like this?
Well, one of the main benefits is that it can lead to a more collaborative political culture. Since no single party is likely to have a majority, they need to work together to form coalitions and pass legislation.
So it encourages compromise and negotiation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the downside is that it can also lead to more fragmented and unstable governments, especially if those coalitions are weak or prone to infighting.
So there's a trade-off between representation and stability. That's really interesting. And what about the federal system? How does that work in practice in Mexico?
Well, as we touched on earlier, federalism means that power is divided between the federal government, state governments, and the government of Mexico City. Each level has its own set of responsibilities and areas where it has the authority to make decisions.
And you mentioned earlier that this was a pretty controversial issue when they were drafting the Constitution.
It was. And you can still see that tension playing out today. There's this constant push and pull between the different levels of government as they try to figure out who gets to call the shots on what.
So it's this dynamic system where the balance of power is constantly being negotiated.
Exactly. And it plays out in a lot of different ways. For instance, the federal government might control things like national defense and foreign policy, while state governments might have more say over things like education and healthcare.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot between national unity and giving regions the freedom to make their own choices. It sounds tricky.
It can be. It requires constant communication, compromise, and a willingness to adapt to new challenges.
Okay, this is starting to make a lot of sense, but I still keep coming back to this question. If power is constantly in flux, as you say, how can everyday citizens make sure that the Mexican government stays accountable to the people and doesn't slip back into those old, less democratic ways of doing things?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's relevant not just to Mexico, but to any country that claims to be a democracy.
So what's the answer? How can citizens keep those in power in check?
Well, the notes offer some interesting insights. They emphasize the importance of having citizens who are informed and engaged, people who understand the system and are willing to participate.
So knowledge is power, literally.
You get it. When people understand how their government works, what their rights are, and how to get involved, they're in a much better position to hold those in power accountable.
Okay, that makes sense. But how can citizens actually make a difference? What are some concrete actions they can take to make sure the government is truly working for the people?
Well, the most obvious one is voting. Making your voice heard at the ballot box is crucial. But it's not enough to just show up. You need to be informed about who you're voting for and what the issues are. You need to understand the different levels of government and how they work.
So it's about being an informed voter, not just picking a name at random.
Exactly. And beyond voting, there are tons of other ways to engage. You can contact your representatives, attend town hall meetings, organize protests, even run for office yourself. It's all about finding ways to make your voice heard and demand action on the issues you care about.
It's like having a whole toolbox of options and choosing the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And those in power are way more likely to listen when they know their constituents are paying attention.
It's like that saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The more transparent things are, the less room there is for shady dealings.
Now, the notes also make a really interesting point about the role of the media in all of this.
Ah, yes, the media. It seems like everybody's got an opinion about the media these days.
They do. But, love it or hate it, the media plays a crucial role in holding those in power accountable. A free and independent press is essential for any functioning democracy.
It's like the watchdog that barks when things are going wrong, keeping those in power honest.
Exactly. But as citizens, we also have to be smart about how we consume media. We need to be aware of biases, check our sources, and try to get a variety of different perspectives. Don't just read headlines, really engage with the news critically.
So it's not just about getting information, it's about thinking critically about that information.
Right. And don't underestimate the power of social media either. It can be a really effective tool for organizing, sharing information, and putting pressure on those in power.
But of course, we have to be careful about misinformation and echo chambers, right?
Definitely. Social media is a double-edged sword. It can be used for good or for bad. It all comes down to using your critical thinking skills and being aware of the potential pitfalls.
So it's about navigating that digital landscape carefully. Okay, so bringing it back to the Mexican Constitution, I think it's a really interesting example of how citizens can shape and constrain power within a system of governance.
I agree. What do you think are some of the key takeaways from the Mexican experience?
Well, for one thing, it shows how important it is to build those core democratic principles right into the foundation of the system. Things like individual rights, the rule of law, separation of powers, checks and balances, those have to be more than just good intentions. They have to be backed up by strong institutions and a solid legal framework.
So it's about designing the system in a way that safeguards against abuse of power.
Exactly. And I think the Mexican Constitution also shows how valuable federalism can be. Dividing power between different levels of government can help to prevent any one person or group from becoming too powerful.
It's like that layered cake we were talking about earlier. It helps to distribute power more evenly and create a more balanced system.
Right. And finally, I think the Mexican experience really highlights how important it is to have an active and engaged citizenry. It's not enough to have a good constitution and a well-designed system of government. If the people aren't involved in holding those in power accountable, then the whole system can break down.
So it all goes back to that idea of power as a flux. It's a constant dance, and it's up to the people to make sure the dance moves in the right direction.
I love that analogy. This has been such a mind-blowing deep dive. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of how power works, how states have evolved, and how citizens can participate in shaping the future.
It's been amazing exploring these ideas with you, and I hope our listeners are feeling equally inspired and ready to get involved.
Me too. And for everyone listening out there, I want to leave you with this question. We've been talking about Mexico, but how does the balance of power play out in your country? What are the unique challenges and opportunities for making your voice heard where you live?
That's a great question to reflect on. And remember, the fight for a more just and equitable society is never truly over. It's an ongoing process. It takes constant effort and vigilance and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
It's kind of wild to think about how, even with all these systems in place, those older, less democratic ways of wielding power don't just disappear.
Yeah, it's like they just find new ways to adapt and sneak back in.
So how do we even begin to deal with that? If power is always shifting and changing like we've been talking about, how can we make sure it's used for the right reasons?
I think the big takeaway here is that we can't afford to be complacent. Just because a country has a constitution, democratic institutions, all that stuff, doesn't mean we can just sit back and assume everything's going to be fine.
Right, so democracy is not like a set it and forget it kind of thing. It needs constant attention.
Exactly. And it all starts with knowledge. These lecture notes really hammer home the point that an informed citizenry is crucial for a healthy democracy.
Makes sense. If you don't understand the rules of the game, are some concrete actions people can take to hold those in power accountable?
Well, there's the obvious one. Voting. Making your voice heard at the ballot box is huge.
Mm.
But, and this is important, it's not enough to just vote. You need to be informed, right? You got to know who you're voting for, what they stand for, what the issues are.
So do your homework before you head to the polls. Don't just pick a name at random.
Exactly. And beyond voting, there are so many other ways to get involved. Contacting your representatives, showing up at town hall meetings, organizing or joining protests. These are all ways to make your voice heard and push for action on the issues you care about.
It's like you've got this whole toolbox of options and you pick the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And let me tell you, those in power are way more likely to listen when they know people are watching, when they know they'll be held accountable for their actions.
It's that whole sunlight is the best disinfectant idea, right? Transparency is key.
Now, the notes also bring up something really interesting about the role of the media in all of this.
Yes, the media. Everyone's got an opinion about the media these days.
Right. But, love it or hate it, the media plays a huge role in holding those in power accountable. A free and independent press is absolutely essential for a healthy democracy.
It's like that watchdog, always keeping an eye out, barking when things go wrong.
Exactly. But as citizens, we've got a responsibility too. We can't just passively consume whatever the media throws at us. We need to be critical thinkers.
So be aware of biases, check sources, get different perspectives, don't just read the headlines.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And hey, don't forget about social media. It can be a powerful tool for organizing, spreading information, holding those in power accountable.
Though it's important to be aware of the downsides too, right? Misinformation, echo chambers, all that.
Totally. Social media is a double-edged sword. Powerful, but you got to use it wisely. Okay, so circling back to the Mexican Constitution, I think it offers some valuable lessons for us all about how citizens can shape and influence power within a system of governance.
Can you expand on that a bit? What are some of the key takeaways from the Mexican experience?
Well, one thing that stands out is the importance of enshrining those core democratic principles in the very foundation of the system. You know, individual rights, the rule of law, separation of powers, checks and balances. Those need to be more than just ideas. They have to be baked into the structure of the government.
So it's about building in those safeguards from the get-go.
Right. And I think the Mexican Constitution also highlights the value of federalism. As we discussed, that division of power between different levels of government can help prevent any one entity from becoming too dominant.
It's like having multiple points of power, so no one group can control everything.
Exactly. And last but not least, I think the Mexican experience really shows how crucial and active and engaged citizenry is. You can have the best constitution in the world, a perfectly designed system, but if the people aren't involved, if they're not holding their leaders accountable, the whole thing can fall apart.
It all comes back to that idea of power being in flux, doesn't it? It's not static. It's constantly being negotiated and reshaped. And we as citizens have a role to play in that process.
Couldn't agree more. It's a dance, and the more we understand the steps, the better we can lead.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. Really makes you think about the complexities of power, how states have evolved, and what we can do to create a more just and equitable world.
I've really enjoyed exploring these ideas with you. It's been a fantastic journey.
And for all of you deep divers out there, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this final thought. We've been talking about Mexico, but how does this all apply to you, wherever you are in the world? How can you use your knowledge, your voice, your actions to make sure power is used responsibly and ethically for the good of all, not just a select few? It's a question worth asking ourselves every single day.
Absolutely. And as you continue on your own deep dives into the world of power, remember this. The quest for a just and equitable society is never truly over. It's a journey that demands constant attention, vigilance, and the courage to challenge the status quo. Keep learning, keep questioning, and never underestimate your power to make a difference.
Beautifully said. Until next time, deep divers, keep exploring, stay curious, and remember, your voice matters.